They dragged their 91-year-old father to the edge and threw him into the sea. The man who gave them life was reduced to an obstacle. "Your time's up," they said. "I want my inheritance." The morning salt air carried promises that Walter Hayes had learned to read like scripture. At 73, his weathered hands still moved with purpose as he adjusted the nets, each motion a prayer whispered to the Atlantic that had shaped 3 generations of Hayes men. The small fishing boat rocked gently against the dock, patient as an old dog waiting for its master. Walter's father had taught him that the ocean never lied. It gave what you earned and took what you couldn't hold. His grandfather, a man of few words but steady hands, had built the first Hayes boat with wood from the coastal pines, believing that what you created with your own hands would never truly abandon you. The house behind him stood modest against the morning sky, its white paint weathered but dignified. Margaret had chosen that paint color 45 years ago, saying it would reflect the light and make their small home feel larger. She had been right about most things, Walter thought, running his fingers along the boat's edge where her name was carved in careful letters. Inside the house, the kitchen still held traces of her presence. The ceramic bowl where she mixed biscuit dough, the window she'd insisted on enlarging so she could watch him return from the sea. Margaret's sewing corner remained untouched, her measuring tape draped over the chair like a promise deferred. Walter pulled his worn notebook from his jacket pocket, its leather cover soft from years of handling. Each page contained fragments of his days, weather patterns, fishing notes, conversations with neighbors, and lately, thoughts that felt too important to trust to memory alone. He wrote slowly, deliberately, recording the wind direction and the color of the dawn. The notebook held more than daily observations. Between weather reports and grocery lists, Walter had begun documenting decisions that would outlive him. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory from a conversation years past. A house should bring children together, not tear them apart. Her words had gained weight as their 3 children grew into adults with different hungers. Caleb, his firstborn, visited monthly now, each conversation circling back to practical matters, property values, maintenance costs, the burden of aging. Noah called weekly but rarely visited, his voice carrying guilt across the distance. Only Lydia remained close, her presence as steady as the tides, her hands gentle when his own began to shake. Walter closed the notebook and tucked it back into his pocket. The sun climbed higher, painting the water in shades of gold that Margaret would have tried to capture in her quilts. He breathed deeply, tasting the familiar mixture of salt and possibility that had sustained his family for decades. Tomorrow would bring its own weather, its own choices. But this morning belonged to memory, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who had built his life on honest work and enduring love. Lydia arrived as Walter finished his breakfast, her nurse's uniform crisp despite the early hour. She moved through the house with practiced efficiency, checking his medications and noting which pills he'd forgotten. At 38, she had inherited her father's steady presence and her mother's intuitive understanding of what needed doing without being asked. "Dad, you left the stove on again," she said gently, turning off the gas under the empty coffee pot. Her concern carried no judgment, only the careful attention of someone who understood that independence was a treasure worth protecting as long as possible. Walter watched his daughter's reflection in the kitchen window as she worked. Lydia had chosen to remain unmarried, dedicating herself to caring for others, first as profession, then as calling when his needs became more evident. He wondered sometimes if his daughter's devotion was gift or sacrifice, but her contentment seemed genuine. "Noah called last night," Lydia mentioned, arranging his pills in the daily dispenser. "Says he might drive down next weekend." Walter nodded, knowing Noah's visits followed a pattern of good intentions and last-minute complications. The middle child carried burdens that Walter couldn't fully understand. Caught between Caleb's certainty and Lydia's dedication, Noah seemed to drift through life like a boat without anchor. The phone rang, interrupting Walter's thoughts. Caleb's voice carried across the line with its usual mixture of efficiency and barely contained impatience. "Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about winterizing the house properly. There are contractors who specialize in coastal properties, people who understand the long-term maintenance issues." Walter listened, hearing beneath his son's words the familiar refrain about practical decisions and financial responsibility. Caleb spoke of the house as if it were merely an asset requiring management, not the repository of a family's accumulated dreams and sorrows. "The foundation needs attention," Caleb continued, "and that roof won't last another storm season. I know a guy who could give us an estimate for both repairs and market evaluation." "Market evaluation?" Walter asked, though he already knew where the conversation was heading. "Just to understand our options, Dad. Knowledge is power, right? We need to think about the future before circumstances force our hand." After the call ended, Walter sat quietly while Lydia finished organizing his medications. She had listened to her brother's half of the conversation, her expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. "He doesn't understand," Lydia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter reached for his notebook, turning to a page marked with Margaret's pressed flower, a wild rose she'd picked during their last walk together before her final hospital stay. Beneath the flower, he had written a single line: "Some things are worth more than their weight in gold." Lydia read the words over his shoulder, her hand resting gently on his arm. In that moment, Walter felt the profound comfort of being understood without explanation, a gift that had sustained him through Margaret's absence and would carry him through whatever decisions lay ahead. The quilting circle met every Tuesday in the community center, a tradition that had survived 3 generations of coastal women. Walter sometimes walked Margaret there before her illness, carrying her sewing basket and staying for coffee with husbands who had learned that patience was the price of peace. Now Lydia attended in her mother's place, though she possessed neither Margaret's skill nor natural gift for the delicate work. The women welcomed her with the gentle kindness reserved for those carrying inherited responsibilities. Mrs. Chen, whose husband had fished alongside Walter for 30 years, always saved Lydia the chair beside the window where Margaret used to sit. "Your mother had magic fingers," Mrs. Chen would say, examining Lydia's careful but imperfect stitches. "But you have her heart for the work, and that's what matters most." The quilting circle served as the town's informal communication network, where concerns were shared in careful code and solutions offered through oblique suggestion. When Lydia mentioned Walter's increasing forgetfulness, the morning coffee pot, missed appointments, conversations that repeated themselves, the women understood the weight of her unspoken fears. "Men don't age gracefully," observed Mrs. Patterson, whose husband had fought similar battles with dignity before accepting help. "They think asking for assistance means admitting defeat." Lydia's hands stilled on the fabric as she considered her brother's different approaches to their father's aging. Caleb pushed for immediate action, treating Walter's forgetfulness as evidence of incompetence. Noah avoided the subject entirely, as if acknowledging change might accelerate its arrival. "Your father's still got his wits," Mrs. Chen said, threading a needle with practiced ease. "I see him every morning at the harbor writing in that notebook of his. A man who records his thoughts isn't losing them." The observation comforted Lydia, who had noticed her father's increasing attachment to the worn leather notebook. She had glimpsed him writing in it during quiet moments, his expression thoughtful rather than confused, his handwriting still steady and deliberate. That evening, Lydia found Walter sitting on the front porch, watching the sun paint the ocean in shades of amber and rose. The notebook lay open in his lap, his pen moving slowly across the page. She settled beside him without speaking, understanding that some moments required silence more than conversation. "Your mother always said the sunset belonged to whoever took time to watch it," Walter said eventually, closing the notebook and tucking it into his shirt pocket. "She believed that beauty was a choice, not an accident." Lydia leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth that had comforted her through childhood fears and adult disappointments. Her father's presence remained constant even as his body grew frailer, his love unchanged, despite the small failures that worried her brothers. "Caleb called again today," she mentioned carefully. Walter nodded, unsurprised. "He means well. Fear makes people want to control things they can't control. And Noah? Noah's afraid of choosing wrong, so he doesn't choose at all." Walter's voice carried no criticism, only the sad understanding of a father who had watched his children struggle with burdens he couldn't lift for them. As darkness settled over the water, Walter reached for Lydia's hand, his fingers still strong despite their tremor. In that touch, she felt the accumulated weight of his love and the quiet confidence of a man who had made his peace with whatever choices lay ahead. Sunday dinner had been Margaret's tradition, a weekly gathering that survived her absence through Lydia's determined efforts. The dining room table, scarred by decades of family meals, still bore the slight indentation where Margaret's sewing machine had sat during lean winters when she took in extra work to supplement Walter's uncertain catches. Caleb arrived promptly at 1 o'clock, his expensive car looking out of place on the gravel driveway. He brought flowers, store-bought roses that lacked the wild beauty of the coastal blooms Margaret had preferred, and a bottle of wine that would remain unopened. His gestures carried the mechanical thoughtfulness of a man fulfilling obligations. Noah appeared 30 minutes later, apologetic and carrying a bag of groceries to compensate for his lateness. He hugged Walter with genuine affection, but avoided eye contact, as if afraid his father might read the uncertainty that plagued his thoughts. The meal proceeded with careful conversation, each family member navigating around subjects that might disturb the fragile peace. Caleb spoke of his business, describing deals and acquisitions with the enthusiasm of someone who found validation in other people's money. Noah listened politely while helping Lydia serve, his movement suggesting someone more comfortable in motion than in stillness. Walter observed his children with the quiet attention he usually reserved for reading weather patterns. Caleb's impatience manifested in small gestures, checking his phone, glancing at his watch, adjusting his silverware with unnecessary precision. Noah's discomfort showed in his reluctance to engage, responding to questions with careful brevity that revealed nothing of substance. "The Hendersons are selling their place," Caleb mentioned during dessert, his tone carefully casual. "Got an offer from developers who want to build condominiums. Good money for property that's been in the family 40 years. Walter continued eating his pie, saying nothing. Lydia's fork stilled halfway to her mouth. "Times are changing," Caleb continued. "Coastal property values are rising faster than anyone expected. People are realizing these old houses are sitting on gold mines." "The Hendersons' house was their home," Walter said quietly. "Now it's someone else's investment. Different things entirely. But Dad, being practical doesn't diminish the sentimental value. It's about securing the future, making sure the family's needs are met. Mom would have understood that." The mention of Margaret hung in the air like a challenge. Walter set down his fork and looked directly at his eldest son, his eyes carrying the accumulated authority of 7 decades. "Your mother understood the difference between having something and holding it. She knew that some things lose their value the moment you try to sell them." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Noah studied his hands, trapped between agreement and family loyalty. Lydia began clearing dishes with unnecessary vigor, the plates clattering with her suppressed frustration. After Caleb left with promises to call during the week, Walter retreated to his study. The small room overlooked the harbor, its walls lined with books about maritime history and navigation. Margaret's presence lingered here in the hand-sewn curtains and the small ceramic bowl where she had left him peppermints during his evening reading. Walter opened his notebook to a fresh page and began writing, his words careful and deliberate. Some decisions, he wrote, required more courage than others. Some inheritances were heavier than the recipients expected. Some gifts were too precious to be given to anyone who might mistake them for mere possessions. October brought the kind of storms that reminded coastal residents why their ancestors had built houses sturdy rather than stylish. Walter watched from his kitchen window as rain lashed the harbor, sending smaller boats straining against their moorings. The weather matched his growing unease about Caleb's increasing visits and increasingly direct questions about the house, the property, and Walter's plans for both. The notebook had become his refuge and his weapon, filled now with more than weather observations and daily reflections. Between grocery lists and medication reminders, Walter had begun documenting conversations with his eldest son, dates, times, and the particular words Caleb used when he thought his father wasn't paying attention. Assessment, evaluation, market conditions, optimal timing, the vocabulary of someone who had already made decisions and was simply waiting for the right moment to implement them. Walter recognized the language because he had heard Margaret use similar terms when she discussed difficult patients at the hospital, people who needed careful management rather than honest conversation. Lydia arrived during the worst of the storm, her raincoat dripping as she hung it by the door. She moved with the purposeful energy of someone accustomed to working through adverse conditions, checking the windows for leaks and adjusting towels beneath the old frames. "Caleb called the house 3 times yesterday," she said without preamble. "When you didn't answer, he called the hospital and asked if I thought you were having episodes." Walter felt something cold settle in his stomach. Episodes? His word. He wanted to know if you'd been confused, forgetting things, making poor decisions. Lydia's voice carried an edge that reminded Walter of Margaret when she was particularly angry. "I told him you were sharper than men, half your age, but he kept pushing." The implication struck Walter like a physical blow. Caleb wasn't simply impatient about inheritance, he was building a case for incompetence. The careful questions, the suggestions about contractors and evaluations, the repeated mentions of Walter's age and occasional forgetfulness, all of it was preparation for something larger. "He asked about the notebook," Lydia continued, her words confirming Walter's worst fears. "Wanted to know what you write in it, whether you've been making financial decisions or legal arrangements without consulting anyone." Walter's hand moved instinctively to his shirt pocket where the notebook rested. The leather had grown soft from handling, molded to the shape of his chest. Inside were thoughts too important for speech, decisions too complex for casual conversation, and plans that his children might not understand but would certainly judge. That evening, Noah called just as the storm began to weaken. His voice carried unusual tension, the careful control of someone delivering difficult news. "Dad, I need to tell you something. Caleb asked me to come to his office next week. He wants to discuss family business." Noah paused, and Walter could hear his son's internal struggle. "He mentioned bringing a lawyer." Walter closed his eyes, feeling the weight of betrayal settle around him like a familiar coat. Caleb wasn't content to wait for natural events to unfold. He was orchestrating them, gathering allies and professional support for a confrontation Walter now understood had been planned for months. "What did you tell him?" Walter asked. "I said I'd think about it." Noah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Dad, I don't know what he's planning, but I don't think it's something you'd want. I don't know how to stop it without making everything worse." After the call ended, Walter sat in his study listening to the storm's retreat. The harbor gradually calmed, boats settling into their natural rhythm as the wind died. But inside the house, Walter felt a different kind of weather system building, one that would test everything he had built and everyone he loved. He opened his notebook to a clean page and began writing, his words steady despite the tremor in his hands. Some storms, he wrote, could be weathered with patience and good anchoring. Others required different strategies entirely. The lawyer's office occupied the second floor of the town's only professional building, a modest structure that had housed doctors, accountants, and attorneys for 40 years. Samuel Morrison had handled the Hayes family's simple legal needs since Walter and Margaret bought their house: deed transfers, wills, the basic paperwork that marked life's major transitions. Caleb had requested the meeting, describing it as a family consultation about estate planning and future security. Walter agreed to attend, though his notebook now contained detailed observations about his son's recent behavior and increasingly transparent motivations. Morrison, a man in his 60s with the careful demeanor of someone accustomed to family disputes, spread documents across his conference table like a dealer arranging cards. Power of attorney forms, competency evaluations, guardianship papers, the legal machinery for transferring control from one generation to the next. These are simply options, Morrison explained, his voice carrying professional neutrality. Documents that ensure family wishes are respected if circumstances change unexpectedly. Caleb sat forward, his posture suggesting someone prepared for negotiation. Dad's been having some memory issues lately. Nothing serious yet, but we want to be proactive. Make sure important decisions don't fall through the cracks. Walter studied his son's face, noting the careful choice of words, the way Caleb avoided direct eye contact while making accusations disguised as concerns. This was strategy, not spontaneous worry. I'd like to see examples of these memory issues, Walter said quietly. Specific incidents, dates, witnesses. Caleb's composure flickered slightly. Dad, it's not about keeping score. It's about being responsible. The morning you left the stove on, the afternoon you missed your doctor's appointment, the time Lydia found you walking toward town without remembering where you were going. Each example was accurate but incomplete, stripped of context that might complicate Caleb's narrative. Walter had left the stove on after receiving news that Mrs. Chen's husband had been hospitalized. He had missed the appointment because he was helping search for a neighbor's lost dog. The walk toward town had been intentional, not confused. He was meeting the mailman to send a letter he preferred to handle personally. Mr. Hayes, Morrison interjected gently, these documents don't transfer power immediately. They simply ensure that trusted family members can make decisions if you're ever unable to make them yourself. And who determines when I'm unable? Walter asked. Morrison glanced at Caleb before responding. Typically, family members in consultation with medical professionals. Walter understood the mechanism now, a system that could be triggered by opinion rather than objective evidence, controlled by people who might benefit from finding him incompetent. Caleb had researched the process thoroughly, identifying legal pathways that required minimal proof and maximum family cooperation. I need time to consider this, Walter said, gathering the documents. Important decisions shouldn't be rushed. Caleb's frustration became visible. Dad, we're not trying to rush anything. We're trying to prevent crisis. What happens if you have a stroke or fall or... What happens is what always happens, Walter interrupted. Life continues. People adapt. Families make the best decisions they can with the information they have. The meeting ended with uncomfortable politeness, Morrison promising to hold the documents until Walter reached a decision. In the parking lot, Caleb made one final attempt at persuasion. Dad, I know this feels threatening, but I'm trying to protect you. Protect all of us. The house, the property, everything you and Mom built. It could all be lost if we're not careful. Walter looked at his son, successful, confident, afraid, and felt a profound sadness. Caleb genuinely believed he was acting from love, but his version of protection required Walter to surrender everything that still gave his life meaning. Son, Walter said gently, you can't protect something by destroying it. That's not love, that's possession. Lydia found the legal documents that evening, neatly stacked on Walter's kitchen counter beside his reading glasses and a cup of cold coffee. She read through each page with the methodical attention her nursing training had taught her, understanding immediately what Caleb had attempted and why her father's mood had grown so somber. He actually brought you to a lawyer? She asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. Walter nodded, settling into his favorite chair with the notebook that had become his constant companion. Says he's protecting the family. Protecting me from my own poor judgment. Lydia's hands shook slightly as she set the papers aside. Her brother's betrayal felt personal, a violation of the unspoken agreements that held their fractured family together. Caleb had always been decisive, sometimes ruthlessly so, but this crossed boundaries she hadn't imagined he would breach. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Walter opened his notebook, revealing pages covered with careful handwriting, dated entries that chronicled months of conversations and observations. Lydia recognized her father's methodology, the same systematic approach he used for everything important, from tracking weather patterns to maintaining his boat. "I'm going to make sure the truth is documented," Walter said. "Whatever happens next, there will be a record of what really occurred and why." That night, Walter wrote until his hand cramped, filling pages with memories and decisions that would outlive him. He wrote about Margaret's final weeks, when they had discussed what should happen to the house, the boat, the accumulated possessions of a shared lifetime. He wrote about each of his children, their strengths, their fears, the different ways they carried their mother's absence. Most importantly, he wrote about choice. Margaret had been clear. The house should go to whoever would love it rather than manage it, who would see it as sanctuary rather than asset. They had agreed that forcing their children to compete for inheritance would dishonor everything they had built together. The next morning brought Noah's arrival, unexpected and clearly troubled. He moved through the house like someone visiting a crime scene, his guilt evident in every gesture. Lydia watched her middle brother with growing frustration, recognizing the internal conflict that would ultimately paralyze him when decision time arrived. "Caleb wants to meet again next week," Noah said, accepting the coffee Lydia offered but not drinking it. "Says Morrison needs to explain some additional options." "Options?" Walter asked. Noah avoided eye contact. "Something about emergency procedures. Ways to expedite things if there's a medical crisis or mental health concern." Walter felt the trap closing around him, constructed with legal precision and family cooperation. Caleb wasn't simply planning to wait for natural incapacity. He was preparing to manufacture it, creating situations that would justify immediate intervention. "Noah," Walter said gently, "I need you to understand something. Whatever your brother has planned, it will destroy this family. Not the house, not the money, the family itself. Once that trust is broken, it can never be fully repaired." Noah's composure cracked slightly. "I don't want to choose sides, Dad. I just want everyone to be okay." "Sometimes not choosing is a choice," Walter replied. "Sometimes neutrality serves the person with the most power." That afternoon, Walter walked to the harbor alone, his notebook tucked securely in his jacket. The boats rocked gently in their slips, patient and enduring despite the storms they weathered. He understood why his grandfather had trusted the sea more than people. Water was honest about its intentions, dangerous but never deceptive. As sunset approached, Walter made a decision that had been building for weeks. Opening his notebook to a fresh page, he began writing instructions that would protect what mattered most, even if they couldn't save what he was about to lose. The confrontation Walter had been dreading arrived on a Tuesday morning when Caleb appeared at the house accompanied by Dr. Reynolds, the family physician who had treated Margaret during her final illness. Reynolds looked uncomfortable, his medical bag clutched tightly as if it could shield him from the ethical complexities of his mission. "Dad, Dr. Reynolds agreed to do a basic competency evaluation," Caleb announced, his tone suggesting this was routine healthcare rather than orchestrated intervention, just to establish a baseline for insurance purposes. Walter understood immediately that this was the emergency procedure Noah had mentioned, a medical evaluation that could provide legal justification for whatever Caleb planned next. Reynolds would be pressured to find evidence of cognitive decline, however mild, that could support a competency challenge. "I don't recall requesting an evaluation," Walter said calmly. "Sometimes people don't recognize when they need help," Caleb replied, his prepared response revealing how thoroughly he had planned this encounter. "That's why families have to step in." Reynolds opened his bag reluctantly, producing the standard tests for mental acuity, memory exercises, problem-solving tasks, questions designed to reveal confusion or disorientation. Walter cooperated politely, answering each question with the precision of someone who understood the stakes involved. When Reynolds asked him to spell world backwards, Walter complied and then added DLROW. 5 letters, like the number of years Margaret and I discussed what should happen to this house after we're gone. The reference to advanced planning was intentional, a signal that Walter's thoughts were organized rather than scattered. Reynolds noted the response, his expression suggesting professional curiosity about Walter's unusual clarity during what was supposed to reveal cognitive impairment. Caleb grew increasingly frustrated as the evaluation proceeded without producing the evidence he needed. Walter's memory remained sharp, his reasoning clear, his responses appropriate to each question. When Reynolds asked about recent events, Walter provided detailed accounts of conversations, including accurate quotes from their meeting with Morrison. "Mr. Hayes," Reynolds said finally, closing his notebook, "I don't see any indication of cognitive impairment. Your memory, reasoning, and judgment all appear to be functioning normally." Caleb's jaw tightened. But what about the forgetfulness? The missed appointments? Lydia mentioned several concerning incidents. Reynolds looked between father and son, recognizing the family dynamics that had prompted this unusual house call. Occasional forgetfulness is normal at any age, particularly during periods of stress or grief. I see no evidence that Mr. Hayes is unable to make his own decisions. After Reynolds left with polite promises to send a written report, Caleb remained, his careful strategy undermined by his father's mental competence. Walter watched his son struggle with the collapse of months of planning, feeling sadness rather than triumph. "Why are you doing this to me?" Caleb asked, his composure finally cracking. "I'm trying to help. I'm trying to make sure you're taken care of, that the family doesn't lose everything because of pride or stubbornness." Walter reached for his notebook, turning to a page marked with one of Margaret's pressed flowers. "Son, read this." The page contained a letter in Margaret's handwriting, dated 2 years before her death. Her words were clear and decisive. The house should remain with whoever understood that homes were built from love, not purchased with money. She had specifically requested that it never become a source of conflict between their children. Caleb read the letter twice, his expression shifting from frustration to something approaching desperation. Mom wrote this when she was sick. She might not have been thinking clearly about the financial implications, about what it would mean for the family's security. Your mother was dying. Not stupid, Walter said quietly. She understood exactly what this house meant, and what would happen to this family if we let money become more important than memory. The conversation ended with Caleb's departure, but Walter knew this was escalation rather than resolution. His son's next move would be more direct, more desperate, and probably more dangerous to the fragile relationships that still held their family together. That evening, Walter added new entries to his notebook, documenting the failed evaluation and Caleb's increasingly erratic behavior. Some truths, he wrote, could only be preserved through careful documentation and patient witness. The boat invitation came through Noah, who delivered it with the nervous energy of someone carrying a message he didn't fully understand. Caleb had suggested a family outing, a sunset cruise to honor Margaret's memory and clear the air after recent tensions. The gesture seemed uncharacteristically sentimental for Caleb, which immediately raised Walter's suspicions. "He says we need to talk as a family, away from distractions," Noah explained, his words carrying the rehearsed quality of someone repeating instructions. "Somewhere private where we can remember Mom and figure out how to move forward together." Lydia's reaction was immediate and visceral. "Absolutely not. Something about this feels wrong." Walter studied Noah's face, reading the conflict between his son's natural loyalty and his growing awareness that Caleb's behavior had crossed important boundaries. Noah wanted to believe in his brother's good intentions, but doubt had begun to corrode his certainty. "What exactly did Caleb say?" Walter asked. Noah shifted uncomfortably. "He said the house talks needed to happen away from the property, somewhere neutral. He thinks being out on the water might help everyone remember what's really important." The logic felt forced. constructed to serve purposes beyond family reconciliation. Walter had spent 60 years reading Water and Weather. He understood when conditions were being arranged rather than naturally occurring. "Dad, please don't go," Lydia said, her nurse's instincts recognizing danger in ways she couldn't articulate. "If Caleb wants to talk, he can do it here, in person, like an adult." But Walter found himself curious about his eldest son's intentions. Caleb's increasingly desperate behavior suggested someone approaching a decisive moment, and Walter wanted to understand what final gambit his son was planning. The notebook in his jacket contained evidence of months of manipulation. Perhaps it was time to confront that evidence directly. That afternoon, Walter made careful preparations. He organized important papers, reviewed the contents of his notebook, and wrote several letters that he sealed and placed in his desk drawer. To Lydia, he entrusted Margaret's wedding ring, a family heirloom that had passed through 3 generations of Hayes women. "Dad, you're scaring me," Lydia said as she accepted the ring. "Why are you giving me this now?" Walter looked at his daughter. Strong, devoted, unspoiled by the ambitions that had warped her brother's judgment, and felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had at least one child who understood what truly mattered. "Some things should stay with people who know how to value them," he said simply. "Your mother would have wanted you to have this regardless of what happens with the house or the property." As evening approached, Walter walked through his home with deliberate attention, touching familiar objects and pausing in doorways where Margaret's presence felt strongest. The house held 60 years of accumulated life, arguments and reconciliations, celebrations and sorrows, the daily intimacies that transform buildings into sanctuaries. In his study, Walter added a final entry to his notebook. Whatever happened on the water, he wrote, his children needed to understand that some inheritances were heavier than others. The house would go to whoever could carry its true value without being crushed by its weight. Noah arrived at 6 o'clock, his anxiety visible in the way he avoided eye contact and fidgeted with his car keys. Caleb was already at the harbor, preparing the boat and checking weather conditions with the thoroughness of someone for whom everything needed to go perfectly. As Walter locked his front door, he felt the weight of his notebook against his chest and the sad certainty that this would be the last time he performed that simple domestic ritual. Some journeys, he understood, were designed to end differently than they began. The boat cut through calm water as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded Walter of the evening he had proposed to Margaret 48 years ago. The Hayes family boat, maintained with the same careful attention Walter gave to everything he loved, responded to the familiar waters with the quiet confidence of a vessel that knew its purpose. Caleb stood at the helm, his posture tense despite the peaceful conditions. He had chosen a route that would take them several miles from shore, far enough to ensure privacy for whatever conversation he had planned. Noah sat beside Walter, his discomfort evident in the way he gripped the boat's rail despite the gentle motion. "Remember when Mom used to make us take sunset cruises every summer?" Caleb said, his voice carrying forced nostalgia. "She said the best conversations happened when people couldn't run away." The reference to Margaret felt calculated, designed to establish emotional context for whatever ultimatum was coming. Walter recognized the manipulation but said nothing, watching his eldest son with the patient attention he usually reserved for reading weather patterns. Lydia had refused to come, her instincts proving more reliable than Noah's desire to maintain family peace. She remained at home, probably pacing through the house and checking her phone, her worry growing with each passing minute. As they moved farther from shore, Caleb began the conversation he had obviously rehearsed. He spoke of responsibility, of difficult decisions that couldn't be postponed, of the hard choices that loving families had to make when older generations became unable to care for themselves. "Dad, I've been patient, but we're running out of time. The house needs major repairs that you can't afford. Your health is declining faster than you want to admit. And these episodes of confusion—" "What episodes?" Walter interrupted. Caleb's preparation faltered slightly. "The incidents Lydia mentioned. The things Dr. Reynolds was concerned about. Reynolds found no evidence of impairment, Walter said calmly. His report will state that explicitly. The reminder of his failed strategy triggered visible frustration in Caleb. His careful plan had been derailed by Walter's mental competence, forcing him to rely on pressure rather than medical justification. "This isn't about competency anymore," Caleb said, his voice rising. "It's about reality. You're living in a house you can't maintain, in a situation that's becoming dangerous. What happens when you fall? When you have a medical emergency? When the roof caves in during the next hurricane?" Walter reached for his notebook, its leather surface worn smooth by months of handling. Inside were documented conversations, dated entries, and evidence of Caleb's systematic campaign to undermine his father's independence. But as his fingers touched the familiar cover, Walter realized that facts wouldn't change his son's fundamental nature. "Caleb," Walter said quietly, "you're not trying to save me. You're trying to save yourself from the uncertainty of not controlling everything." The truth hit like a physical blow. Caleb's composure cracked completely, revealing the fear and frustration that had driven months of manipulation. Noah watched in growing horror as his older brother's mask slipped away, exposing the calculating stranger who had replaced the family member they remembered. The boat rocked slightly as Caleb abandoned the helm, his movements sharp and agitated. Water stretched around them in all directions, beautiful and indifferent to the human drama playing out on its surface. In that moment, Walter understood that his son's desperation had brought them to a place where words would no longer be sufficient to resolve what had been building between them. The argument erupted like a summer squall, sudden and violent after hours of gathering pressure. Caleb's careful facade crumbled as he faced his father's quiet resistance to months of manipulation. The boat drifted in open water, its engine silent, while 3 generations of Hayes men confronted truths that had festered in silence too long. "You stubborn old man!" Caleb shouted, his professional composure replaced by raw frustration. "I'm trying to save this family from disaster, and you're fighting me like I'm the enemy!" Walter remained seated, his notebook clutched in weathered hands, his voice steady despite his son's escalating anger. "Son, you can't save something by destroying what makes it worth saving." Noah attempted to mediate, his voice shaking with the effort to find middle ground. "Maybe we could slow down, talk about options that work for everyone." "There are no options," Caleb interrupted, spinning toward his younger brother. "Dad's living in fantasy land, thinking he can maintain that house and that property on a fisherman's pension and Social Security. The roof leaks, the foundation's settling, and he can barely remember to take his medication." The boat rocked more violently as Caleb's movements became increasingly agitated. Water slapped against the hull with growing intensity, responding to wind patterns Walter recognized as potentially dangerous. The peaceful sunset cruise was transforming into something that demanded immediate attention to navigation and safety. "Caleb, we need to head back," Walter said, gesturing toward the darkening horizon where storm clouds were building. "Weather's changing." But Caleb was beyond hearing practical concerns. His desperation had reached a breaking point where reason no longer influenced his actions. He grabbed Walter's notebook, holding it like evidence in a trial. "What's in here, Dad? What are you planning that you can't share with your own family? More secret decisions? More ways to cut us out of everything you and Mom built?" Walter reached for the notebook, his movement careful but determined. The leather journal contained not just recent observations, but also Margaret's final letter, pressed flowers from their last walks together, and decisions made in love rather than fear. "Give that back," Walter said, his voice carrying an authority that had commanded respect for 7 decades. "No," Caleb replied, holding the notebook beyond his father's reach. "I'm tired of secrets. Tired of being treated like I don't matter. Like my concerns don't count. This family is going to start making sense, starting right now." The confrontation reached its climax as Walter stood, his balance uncertain on the rocking boat. Noah moved to help his father, while Caleb backed away, still clutching the notebook. The three men formed a triangle of competing loyalties and escalating tensions, with the boat's stability compromised by their movements. Walter's hand reached toward his eldest son, not in anger, but in the patient gesture of someone asking for the return of something precious. "Caleb, that notebook contains your mother's last wishes. Her actual words, not what you think she would have wanted." The mention of Margaret stopped Caleb momentarily, his grip on the notebook loosening slightly. In that instant of hesitation, Walter stepped forward, his sea legs steady despite his age. But the boat chose that moment to encounter a larger wave, its motion sudden and unpredictable. The combination of the boat's movement, Walter's forward momentum, and Caleb's startled reaction created a moment of perfect instability. Walter lost his footing, his hand reaching for support that wasn't there, his body tilting toward the water that had been his companion and his sustenance for 73 years. The splash was surprisingly small for such a momentous event. Walter's body entered the water with minimal drama, but the ocean's cold embrace was immediate and unforgiving. The notebook floated for a moment before the waves claimed it, carrying Margaret's final letter and Walter's careful observations toward the depths that had sustained and challenged the Hayes family for 3 generations. The water closed over Walter's head like a familiar blanket, cold and surprisingly peaceful after the heat of family conflict. For a moment, he felt the strange calm of someone who had finally stopped fighting against forces beyond his control. The ocean that had shaped his life was reclaiming him, but without malice or hurry. Above the surface, chaos erupted on the boat. Noah grabbed the wheel, his hands shaking as he tried to maneuver closer to where his father had disappeared. Caleb stood frozen at the rail, the notebook's loss hitting him like a physical blow as he realized the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Dad!" Noah screamed, his voice carrying across the water. "Dad, where are you?" Walter surfaced 20 feet from the boat, his gray head visible against the darkening water. His movements were deliberate rather than panicked, the measured strokes of someone who had spent his life in harmony with the sea. But 73-year-old bodies don't negotiate with ocean temperatures, and Walter felt his strength diminishing with each passing moment. Caleb threw a life preserver, his aim perfect despite his trembling hands. The orange ring landed within Walter's reach, but the old man made no move to grasp it. Instead, he treaded water with increasing difficulty, his eyes fixed on his sons' faces with an expression of profound sadness. "Take it, Dad!" Caleb shouted, his earlier anger replaced by desperate concern. "Please just take the ring!" Walter looked at the life preserver floating beside him, then at the boat where his sons waited with rope and reaching hands. The choice was simple and terrible: accept rescue and return to the conflict that was tearing his family apart, or allow the ocean to provide the resolution that human love couldn't accomplish. "I'm sorry," Walter said, his voice barely carrying across the water. His words were meant for both sons but directed toward the sky where Margaret might be listening. "I'm sorry it came to this." Noah gunned the engine, bringing the boat close enough to touch his father if Walter would just reach out. But Walter's hands remained at his sides, his body gradually surrendering to the water's cold embrace. His choice was becoming clear to both sons, and the terrible weight of that realization hit them simultaneously. "Dad, don't do this," Noah pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "We can fix it. We can figure it out together." Walter's head went under briefly, then emerged again, his breathing labored. When he spoke, his voice carried the tired authority of someone who had made his final decision. "Not for me," he said, his eyes meeting Caleb's anguished stare. "For you, both of you." The words hung in the air like a blessing and a curse. Walter was choosing to remove himself from the equation that had poisoned his family, sacrificing his own survival to prevent his children from destroying each other over his legacy. Caleb dove into the water without hesitation, his expensive clothes and careful appearance forgotten in the face of his father's quiet surrender. Caleb's arms closed around his father's still form, pulling him toward the boat where Noah waited with blankets and radio calls for help that would arrive too late to matter. The ocean had claimed another Hayes man, but this time the sea was serving as witness rather than executioner, recording a sacrifice that would haunt two surviving sons for the rest of their lives. The Coast Guard boat arrived 37 minutes after Noah's emergency call, its searchlights cutting through the gathering darkness like silver knives. He swam with desperate strength, reaching Walter just as the old man's head went under for the final time. But Walter had already let go of whatever debris had been keeping him afloat, his decision final and irreversible. Walter's body lay on the deck of the family boat, covered by a blanket that couldn't warm what had already grown cold. Caleb sat beside his father, his expensive clothes ruined by salt water, his hands still trembling from the effort of trying to save what couldn't be saved. Noah piloted their boat back to harbor with mechanical precision, his grief temporarily suspended by the immediate requirements of navigation and survival. Behind them, the Coast Guard vessel followed like a funeral procession, its lights reflecting off the water where the Hayes family notebook had disappeared, along with Margaret's final letter and Walter's carefully documented observations. Lydia waited at the harbor, her nurse's training allowing her to recognize death before the boats reached shore. She had spent the evening pacing through the house, her anxiety building as darkness fell without word from her family. When the call came from the Coast Guard, she knew that her worst fears had been confirmed. The formal procedures of unexpected death consumed the next several hours. Statements were taken, forms completed, decisions made about funeral arrangements and family notifications. Walter's body was treated with professional respect, but the man who had been their father, grandfather, and anchor was reduced to case numbers and bureaucratic requirements. In the hospital waiting room, the three surviving Hayes children sat without speaking, each processing grief through their own filter of guilt and regret. Caleb stared at his hands, seeing Walter's face in those final moments when his father had chosen the ocean over family reconciliation. Noah replayed the boat trip obsessively, searching for moments when different words or actions might have prevented the tragedy. Lydia held Margaret's wedding ring, the last gift her father had given her, understanding now why he had insisted she receive it that very afternoon. Dr. Reynolds arrived near midnight, his face carrying the weight of having examined Walter just days earlier and found him competent to make his own decisions. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Walter's final choice had been the most decisive and irreversible decision of his 73 years. "I need to ask about his state of mind," Reynolds said gently. Was he depressed? Had he mentioned feeling hopeless or expressed thoughts about ending his life? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Caleb looked at his siblings, wondering how to explain that Walter's death wasn't suicide in any conventional sense, but rather a sacrifice offered to prevent his family's complete destruction. He wasn't depressed, Lydia said firmly. He was tired of fighting, tired of watching his children tear each other apart over things that shouldn't matter. Noah found his voice for the first time since returning to shore. He chose to let go rather than let us destroy ourselves fighting over him. The observation carried devastating accuracy. Walter had recognized that his continued presence would only escalate the conflict between his sons, forcing Noah to choose sides while watching Caleb's desperation spiral into increasingly destructive behavior. By removing himself from the equation, Walter had given his children the opportunity to grieve together rather than fight separately. Reynolds completed his preliminary examination and prepared to sign the death certificate. The official cause would be listed as accidental drowning, but everyone in that room understood the more complex truth. Walter Hayes had died to save his family from themselves. As dawn approached, the Hayes children returned to the house their father had refused to surrender. It looked different now, transformed from contested property into memorial space. The building that had caused so much conflict stood empty and waiting, its future uncertain, but no longer urgent. The funeral was held on a Thursday morning when the tide was coming in, carrying with it the salt smell that Walter had breathed for 7 decades. The small church overflowed with fishermen, neighbors, and townspeople who had known Walter as a man of quiet integrity and stubborn principle. Margaret's grave waited beside the freshly dug earth, their shared headstone bearing dates that told the story of a long marriage concluded. Caleb delivered a eulogy that struggled to find words for the guilt that consumed him. He spoke of Walter's love for his family, his dedication to honest work, and his unwavering moral compass. But every sentence carried the weight of understanding that his father's death had been precipitated by his own desperate campaign for control. Lydia read from Psalm 107, the verses about those who go down to the sea in ships and witness God's wonders in the deep. Her voice remained steady throughout the reading, though her hands shook as she held the Bible that had belonged to Margaret. Noah couldn't speak at all, overcome by the recognition that his silence and indecision had contributed to the family tensions that drove his father into the water. His grief was complicated by survivor's guilt and the terrible knowledge that different choices might have prevented the tragedy. After the burial, the three siblings returned to the house that had caused so much conflict. The building seemed larger now, emptied of Walter's presence but filled with the weight of his sacrifice. They moved through familiar rooms like strangers, uncertain how to relate to each other without their father's steady influence. Caleb found Walter's desk drawer unlocked, containing the letters and documents their father had prepared before the boat trip. Among them was a sealed envelope addressed to all three children, containing Walter's final attempt to explain decisions they might not understand. The letter was brief but definitive. Walter had left the house to Lydia, recognizing her as the child who understood that homes were built from love rather than purchased with money. Caleb and Noah would inherit the boat and fishing equipment, along with savings accounts Walter had quietly maintained for years, but the letter's most important paragraph addressed the family's future rather than its assets. "I am not dividing this family's love," Walter had written. "Love cannot be divided, only shared. What I am dividing are responsibilities. Lydia knows how to care for things that matter. Caleb knows how to protect what he values. Noah knows how to find peace in difficult situations. You each have gifts the others need." The final paragraph carried Walter's deepest hope. "This house will remain in our family only as long as it brings you together rather than driving you apart. If you cannot visit it without fighting, sell it and use the money to build something better. Your mother and I care more about your happiness than our legacy." As afternoon light filtered through windows that Margaret had chosen and Walter had installed, the Hayes children began the long process of learning to be siblings again. The house would remain with Lydia, who understood its value beyond market price. Caleb would eventually find peace in knowing his father's sacrifice had prevented him from destroying what he most wanted to preserve. Noah would discover that some choices, made too late, could still honor the people who deserved better decisions. The ocean continued its eternal rhythm outside their windows, indifferent to human grief, but constant in its reminder that some forces are larger than individual will. Walter Hayes had returned to the sea that shaped his life, leaving behind children who finally understood that the greatest inheritance he could give them was the opportunity to love each other without conditions or competition. The afternoon sun painted the house in shades of gold and rose, the same colors Walter and Margaret had watched together for 48 years. In that light, the Hayes children began the work of becoming a family again, guided by the memory of a man who had loved them enough to let go when holding on would have destroyed what mattered most.